Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Gregg Brazinsky. Gregg is a professor of history and international affairs at the George Washington University and the author of 2 books, both of which will be the topic of today's podcast. Nation Building in South Korea, Korea, Americans and the Making of a Democracy, and Winning the Third World, Sino-American Rivalry During the Cold War. And for me personally, Gregg was a gateway into the study of North Korea and South Korea. His book on nation building in South Korea was one of the first that I picked up in this regard. And professors, at least those that I deeply respected at the time, couldn't speak highly enough of it. They really saw it as something groundbreaking within the field, something that had changed our understanding not just of South Korea, not just of American designs and influence on the peninsula, but also on our understanding of nation building as a whole. But the first part of this podcast is going to have a look at Gregg's second book, which has a slightly broader scope in this regard. That is the China-American rivalry during the Cold War for alliances and resources inside the Third World, and the effect that this has still inside Chinese identity and the way America views China and their rise in the world. Strangely, this is an aspect of history that many people are happy to overlook, or at least don't pay too much attention to. A lot more focus tends to run on the deeper history, the Qing and the Ming dynasties, for example. And yet much more recent, much more pertinent history, such as that of the Cold War, somehow finds itself fallen into a void that Gregg has shed significant light on for us. During this period, China's own legacy of colonization, of suffering and humiliation at the hands of foreign powers, often Western powers, became the experience and the selling point from which they would offer new forms of aid, new styles of nation building, and even new ideas of independence, often in Africa and Asia. In essence, what they were saying is they weren't seeking hierarchy or domination, but a shared experience, a win-win scenario. And this wasn't done just for alliances or just for material gain. China were also seeking status in the world, a return to something that they had in the past, and something that they had lost in recent history. They had a memory of national humiliation, and cults of personality, or at least a way of looking at their leaders that tied them closely to that of the nation as a whole. An insult to one was an insult to both. And as they stepped forward into the world, they bumped up against America, the dominant power, and a power that saw China's expanded influence in the world as a zero-sum game. China's growth would be America's loss, at least in their eyes. And this is a vision of the world that has run through ever since. From this broad picture of the Cold War, we move into nation building in South Korea. This is something that America spent a huge amount of time and resources on during the 20th century. In countries from Japan to Germany to the Philippines, America was trying to win allies in the Cold War, but to do so by the growth of ideas, the feeling that if the right conditions could be implanted into otherwise barren environment, then they would soon flourish. Democracies would emerge, countries would develop, and not just security allies but economic cooperation would soon come about. And one of the great success stories in this was South Korea, a country that before American nation building efforts was on its knees. It had come out of the Japanese colonial period divided, not just as a nation but internally between social and political factions. The economy had been torn apart by the division of the country, and soon the Korean War would make this all the worse. And yet by the end of the 20th century, South Korea had become a dominant power in the world, a democratic nation, a powerful economic nation, and undoubtedly a success story. And it's this narrative, this explanation that Gregg talks about and explains throughout his book. What Gregg fundamentally tackles here are the deep issues of this change. Why were America so attached to South Korea? Why did they supply so many resources, so much effort, and even risk American lives for its survival? And why were these efforts so successful on the Korean Peninsula? Why were Koreans so capable of adapting these policies and making them their own? Why did Korea succeed when so many other nations out there, who America had similar hopes and similar designs on, fail? And Gregg doesn't shy away from the big questions. That is, what role did America have in not just building up, in his words, a developmental autocracy, but in propping up or sustaining this autocracy in times and places that many people have considered it wasn't necessary? Gregg provides incredible nuance here and does what many historians shy away from, offers incredibly valuable hypothetical examples of why he thinks this developmental autocracy was so important in certain places and why in others perhaps it wasn't necessary. What we get here at its core is nuance, fresh new historical details, and an incredibly rigorous level of historical research. And overall, a picture of the world in which history is vital to the understanding of foreign relations. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on this podcast across social media. All the help in this regard is greatly appreciated. And if you do have any criticisms, any doubts, or any recommendations for future guests on the podcast, please write a comment in any of the links below. On that, and to talk us through the Cold War period, the Sino-American rivalry, and nation building in South Korea, this is Gregg Brazinsky. Gregg Brazinsky, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Now, this is a real treat for myself, actually. I've been aware of your work for quite some time, all the way back in graduate school. I remember all my professors raving about your first book that came out, which we're going to speak about secondly in this podcast. But your newest book also runs along similar lines. So I might ask you a broader question about your research to start off with, if that's okay. It seems to me that there is a strand running through some of your research. I'm not sure if you've intended this or even if you see it yourself, but it seems to be that you have maybe an attack or maybe a push on the declining influence of history in international relations, the idea that history should be more relevant to the present moment.
Yes, absolutely. I think that was definitely part of my consideration in how I framed both of my books. The book about South Korea that you talked about, called Nation Building in South Korea, and also how I framed, to some degree, my second book about Sino-American rivalry and the Third World. I don't know that I've been immensely successful at influencing the policy community with my views, but I do think that the policy community should read the kind of history that I write. And I don't mean to sound, arrogant about that or, self-absorbed, but I do think that diplomatic history, whether it be the more traditional kind of diplomatic history that looks at government officials, or whether it be the sort of newer types of international history that also pay attention to culture and society, all of these kinds of history have a tremendous amount to teach people in the policy community. I also think they have a lot to teach people who work as journalists covering current events. I think a lot of times some informed historical analysis could also benefit what they write.
So let's jump into, from that good starting off point, let's jump into your your second book first, which is Winning the Third World. So this is about the Sino-American, not conflict, but battle for the Third World during the Cold War period. And of course, this is also a period that touches on your first book as well. So to open this up, we may be best to go back to a point that you mentioned in your book, which is Xi Jinping's first foreign trip since taking power. And he goes briefly to Russia, but then spends the majority of his trip in Africa. So why is this so important?
Well, I think, first of all, Africa is going to be a critically important in the 21st century. There's no question about that. And what role will China play in Africa's economic and political development during the 21st century? I think that's also a very important question to consider and a very important issue that we have to consider. China right now is quite influential in Africa in some regards. And I think if you want to understand the roots of that, some of that is in my work. Now, I think there's clearly some differences between Chinese policies in Africa today, the kinds of investments that it makes, the way that it exerts its influence, and the way that it sought to influence Africa during the Cold War. But I think first of all, in the mind of Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders, they actually are trying to carry out a long-standing objective of the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. And that is for China to be an important country, not only globally, but also specifically among other Afro-Asian countries, which also have a history of colonialism, which also have a history of underdevelopment, and where China believes, I think, where Chinese leaders believe very much today, and also I think believed very much during the Cold War, that they have something that they can offer that the United States and its allies in Europe cannot.
And if this is a long-standing objective of Chinese policy, as you've mentioned there, also in this book, you take aim at some of the depth and history in which people are willing to accept that history and how far it goes back. So you mentioned that a lot of scholars will happily look back and trace this all the way back to the Sino-centric tributary system of the Qing and the Ming dynasty. And yet at the same time, they are a lot less happy to accept that the Cold War might have had a much more significant, or at least relatively significant, influence.
Yes, and I think recently I've heard a lot of people saying, "Is there a new Cold War with China?" So I do hear that analogy made more, but at the same time, I don't see a lot of very good analysis of what China was actually doing during the Cold War and what the United States tried to do to stop it. I think if you look at some of the lessons of Sino-American rivalry during the Cold War, you could see that today, that a lot of this does ramify with today in different ways. I think the point you brought up about people looking all the way back to the Ming and Qing dynasty is, history is never irrelevant, but it's just sort of ironic to me that people are, that many people do, sort of say, well, all of China's ambitions in Asia today can be explained by the same Sino-centric world order that existed at that time. And I'm my own work, I don't focus on the Ming and the Qing dynasties that much, but most people who do focus on the Ming and Qing dynasties would say that, actually, that the idea of this, Sino-centric tributary system is actually a very complicated one, and what exactly was entailed in paying tribute. A lot of historians have complicated that. Now, what I think is most relevant about the Cold War is the sort of post-colonial nationalism that China projected in trying to expand its influence in other Afro-Asian countries. I think that is still very much a part of how China sees itself and its relationship to the rest of the world. Some people will say, well, is what China is doing today actually very different from colonialism or neo-colonialism? And you can make a case that it's not. But nonetheless, China definitely doesn't see itself as neo-colonial, very much the opposite in my view.
And why were they so happy, and why were they so successful in this ability to reach out to Africa? Is it just the idea that they both had a shared history, of colonization and suffering, or was there actually something within their message? Because I've seen you mentioned quite a lot throughout the book things like they're offering new models of aid and nation building that better suits the third world. So was there something of substance that you found in what China was offering the third world at this time? Or was it simply a kind of a fraternal brotherhood based on the pains of the past?
Well, I think it was a combination of the two. I think the kinds of economic aid that China offered was very much grounded in post-colonial nationalism and anti-imperialist ideology. So, for instance, one of the things that China would say was that, well, American aid and Soviet aid, what it really does is it tries to make countries in Asia and Africa more dependent on them, whereas Chinese aid is different because it's trying to promote self-sufficiency. So that was one aspect of it. And in some cases, it really did try to do that. It would, a lot of times the United States would want to come in and build schools increase agricultural productivity, develop human capital, things like that actually take a long time before you see any results. Whereas the Chinese would go in and build a matchstick factory in a year or two, and it would be operational, and all of a sudden that country, countries in Africa were more self-sufficient in making matchsticks. So that was one aspect of Chinese economic aid in Africa and elsewhere as well that had an appeal. Another thing that was appealing, and you can even see this if you look at the memoirs of some of the African leaders and African nationalists who work with the Chinese, is that China would really send both aid workers but also laborers down to Africa to work on the railroads that they built, to work on other projects. And when they were working in Africa, they would actually live with more or less the same living standards that the Africans lived with. And this was something that was very appealing. I don't think China is still necessarily using this strategy today, but during the Cold War, it was something that it used to differentiate itself from the United States or the Soviet Union, because it could say, look, the Americans are coming, they build these villages with air conditioning and refrigerators. They don't understand you. China understands what you need. And, you can, certainly, again, today, there's a lot of differences between how China operates and how it operated during the Cold War. But I still think an important part of China's message and how China conceptualizes what it's doing in Africa, in other countries that are being included within the Belt and Road Initiative, is this idea that China can understand the needs of other people that were once victims of colonialism, that experienced underdevelopment, and it can understand them better than other countries.
And another reason for this, and I suppose another motivation that comes through your book here that many listeners may not immediately be aware of, is the idea that China were seeking status in a lot of the interactions with the third world. So you mentioned two key points here. One is this, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of a century of humiliation and such, the idea that China has this deep pain in their not too distant history, and it's something that they are trying to rectify today. But you also mentioned a very interesting point as well, which is the idea that in many parts, often in the Chinese mind, there is an illusion between China and Mao, which of course you mentioned might be has a similar effect today. That is, an insult to the leader becomes an insult to the nation, and vice versa.
Right. Well, I think absolutely that was a very salient dimension of Chinese foreign policy during the Mao Zedong era, because Mao, like other leaders in the communist world, cultivated what people call a cult of personality, meaning that the leader wasn't just sort of a standard popularly elected political ruler or even just a standard dictator. There was a whole there was also, this leader was also producing great writings and was a great thinker in the development of international socialism and was loved by the masses, right? And you saw that in communist China, you saw that in North Korea, you saw that in the Soviet Union to some degree under Stalin, although Stalin's cult of personality was later criticized by subsequent Soviet leaders. But this cult of personality that surrounded Mao made it seem very much to Chinese that if people insulted China, they were also insulting Mao. If they were insulting Mao or Mao's theories, they were also insulting all of China. With Xi Jinping, you do see to some degree the reemergence of this. Obviously, it's not as extreme or as radical as it was during the Mao Zedong period, but you do see elements of this. For instance, one of the things that the Chinese government has been doing lately is promoting Xi Jinping thought. So much like Mao Zedong, he's considered not only to be a political leader and the leader of the Communist Party, but also a major thinker who deserves to be widely respected and loved by the masses, right? So you also so you do see elements of that, and again, I related it to a broader argument that I made about status. I generally think that the importance of status in international affairs hasn't been well appreciated by scholars of foreign relations, and I just found it was so prominent in all of the policy text, both in terms of what the Chinese government was trying to do, but also in terms of what the American motives were. A lot of times when I looked at what the United States was trying to do in its diplomacy towards China, it wasn't to compete with China economically. A lot of the efforts that the United States made to try to limit Chinese influence were of very dubious strategic value. But what they did say was that if we do this, it will stop China from gaining prestige. And I think that was a very important motive for American foreign policy makers, as well as for Chinese officials. And there, too, I think you see something that continues to be an important factor in Chinese decision-making and Chinese policy.
And on that last point, because it does touch with a lot of the things you mentioned throughout your book, the idea of these conferences where China would turn up with an idea that they're going to increase status through it, and America's seeing it almost like a zero-sum game where they would push back as much as possible because they thought they would lose ground here. And of course, this seems to, I'm not sure how you see it, but it seems to have a modern echo with the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. So how do you see that operating today?
Right. Well, I think absolutely. One of the things that China wanted to do during the Cold War period was to build new institutions in which it would play an important role. One of the interesting things is that throughout the Cold War, through much of the Cold War until 1971, China, the People's Republic of China, wasn't admitted to the United Nations, right? And so it wanted to create institutions in which it would really play a more important role. And so it sponsored Afro-Asian conferences. It actually worked with Indonesia to launch a sort of competitor to the Olympics known as the Games of the Newly Emerging Forces, or GENIFO, as they called it. So during the Cold War, it was very much involved in this kind of institution building. Now, of course, the kind of institutions, global institutions that it wants to be involved in are quite different and more, have more market components than previous, than what it was doing during the Cold War. But nonetheless, this desire to sort of create, global institutions in which China will play a very significant role was important then and important now. And again, it's a sort of a very loose parallel, and there's differences, but it's the kind of issue which makes me think that you just can't understand China's foreign policy without understanding and learning about what it was doing during the Cold War. And again, I think it's different from just saying, well, there's a new Cold War between the United States and China, because a lot of times when people say that, it's not even clear what they're comparing China to, right? Are they comparing China to the People's Republic of China during the Cold War? Are they comparing it to the Soviet Union during the Cold War? So I think that analogy is really unclear. We need more specific and well-informed thinking about the current and potential rivalry between China and the United States, one that goes beyond just saying, well, it's a new Cold War, and actually looking at what China did during the Cold War.
Well, before we push on to Korea here, there is a final question, I suppose, on that topic, and that idea that you just mentioned there, the idea that Cold War history and how they find themselves in the present. So how successful do you think China has been over the years in selling its rise? So do you see a change in how they've been perceived from the Cold War up until today? Because there is at least, I suppose, an intuition out there in modern media, at least from the Western side, that China are souring their relationships around the world, especially with things like the South China Sea constructions. But I wonder also how you see African nations viewing China today. Do they still see them through that same fraternal lens, or have they soured in any way, or have relationships improved, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's quite mixed in terms of how other countries perceive China. I do think that when it comes to Southeast Asia, it's right to say that China has been shooting itself in the foot to some degree. During the 1990s and even through about 2007, 2008, China was, I think there wasn't anywhere near as much sort of resistance or concern about China's growing influence as there is now. And part of it has been the territorial issues. In Africa, the reactions are very mixed. I've read some statements by African leaders that say exactly what you would think China wants them to say, that they appreciate Chinese assistance, that China is succeeding where other countries failed in lifting Africa out of poverty. But I also see a lot of criticisms of China. There's criticisms of Chinese meddling in African politics. There's criticisms of Chinese environmental practices in Africa. There's criticisms of Chinese labor practices in Africa. So all of these things sort of coexist. There's no one way that Africa sees China. All of these reactions are present, much as there are a lot of very different reactions to Western or American influence in Africa. But I think it's important that we not exaggerate China's influence in Africa or other parts of the world as well. I think that was a tendency that the United States had very much during the Cold War. Sometimes you still see it now. There are areas where our interests are going to conflict, but there's also areas where we have the same interest. And I think we need to be wary of China on certain fronts, but also realize that there's areas that we need to cooperate. And that's something that really has become more and more worrisome to me over the last 2 or 3 years, that there's been growing anti-China sentiment, growing hostility towards China, and that's going to make it harder and harder for the U.S. and China to work together where they do have common interests.
So let's push on from that framework there to the topic of your first book, which is Korea. Now, the title of this book is Nation Building in South Korea, Koreans, Americans, the Making of American Democracy. And this is, again, along similar lines, look back at the Cold War period. But it runs across a broad idea, I suppose, one that people are vaguely aware of. And it's the idea that during the 20th century, America were involved in a large-scale nation-building exercise around the world. So I might get to open that up for people, because a lot of those terms are common to many people's ears, but they're not really sure what you mean when you say things like nation building.
Right, and actually, I think it's fair enough that people aren't clear on what exactly I mean by that, because there's been so many different definitions. Some people use nation building to just talk about creating an idea of a nation. Some talk about it in terms of creating a legitimate, feasible state. What I try to use it in a context that sort of combines a little bit of both of these. And I talk about nation building as, efforts by the United States to create viable anti-communist states in different parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America during the Third World. In the Third World during the Cold War, but also within these states to try to promote economic development and democratization to the greatest degree possible. Now, when I say that, I don't think that that necessarily means that everything that the United States did was benign, or I certainly wouldn't say that every decision made by the United States promoted democracy. I would say that when it came to what the United States wanted to do, it faced a very complex situation. It faced situations throughout the world that it didn't really, completely understand the complexity of. And in this context, it stumbled. It made some very poor decisions, but it also did do things that promoted democratic values. And I think it's sort of important to recognize this sort of duality in American foreign policy and in the general American approach to nation building.
And to tie that into the broader theme of your book here, I suppose the central question for why you did this research in the first place, if that was a theme that ran across American policy, across the world through Asia and other parts of the world, why was it so significant in South Korea? What was significant about and unique about the South Korean case here?
Right. And I mean, one of the concepts that I emphasize in the book is this idea of developmental autocracy. And this has been, to some degree, one of the more controversial aspects of the book, because people say, well, you just support autocracy, which is not true and not how the book was intended. I wouldn't say that the book, people should use the book as sort of, a manual and say, well, we should therefore go to other countries and where the United States is heavily engaged now, for instance, Afghanistan or Iraq, and create developmental autocracies. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I do think there is a pattern that political scientists and other scholars have identified of a particular kind of state that eventually did become democratic over the course of the latter half of the 20th century. And there was this pattern in Taiwan and South Korea where you had governments that were initially not democratic, but made difficult decisions that were necessary for promoting economic development. Once you did that, you ended up creating a larger, stronger middle class, and these middle classes enabled democracy to be durable in a way that it sometimes isn't in countries where the United States has just sort of gone in and said, all right, let's have an election and then we're done. Elections don't necessarily make they don't assure that a country is going to achieve sustainable democracy. Having a middle class education, a strong educational system, all of these things are just as important as elections if you're going to talk about sustaining democracy in the long term.
So you mentioned two countries there, South Korea and Taiwan. And from your book, if I remember correctly, you mentioned 30-odd cases of nation building, and yet this only seems to have happened in two. Is that the right stat there?
Right. I mean, you can also make a case that it happened in Chile, to a lesser degree in Thailand. I think, so I don't know if these are absolutely the only two cases, but I think if you were to look at countries that today have, I think, sustainable liberal democracies, and I think also democracies where you actually have opposing political parties with different ideas and peaceful transitions between these two political parties. Outside of South Korea and Taiwan, there's really not that many places in the post-colonial world that I could think of that have this.
So let's get into the reasons for why South Korea does have that, which of course is the fundamental core of your book here. before we get there, let's talk about just how the sort of the poor conditions on the ground in South Korea, because it seems at the time when America first really planted their foot on South Korea in 1945 here, that it is a country that's poorly suited for nation building. It's a country that had its statehood wiped off the map by Japanese colonization, and that Japanese colonization also embedded and baked into the pie here deep social divisions between conservatives and the left wing here. And you mentioned through your book, there really wasn't much of a moderate middle ground, I suppose, liberal-ish kind of political groundswell for America to grab onto here.
Right. I mean, I think that's right. From the political perspective, Korea was sharply divided between, especially when it came to sort of elite politics, between people that had a relatively radical agenda and between people that, like Syngman Rhee, that had a fiercely conservative and anti-communist agenda. And there weren't really very many moderates, especially moderates of the kind that the United States believed you could form a viable nation state around. So that was an issue. The economy was also an important issue when you talk about why Americans didn't think nation building could succeed. The division of the Korean Peninsula made things very difficult. Korea had functioned for centuries as a single economic unit. And of course, during the 35 years of Japanese colonialism, Korea was also tightly integrated into the Japanese empire. And much of this integration served the benefit of Japan far more than it served to benefit Koreans, of course. But nonetheless, when you all of a sudden detached it from Japan, this was also a sort of economic rupture. And all of this created, very difficult conditions in Korea in 1945. And it was, of course, made worse by the Korean War, which had a devastating effect on South Korea.
And from that Korean War, you mentioned another, I suppose, a core aspect here, the question of why America became so attached to South Korea. And you mentioned a number of factors here. You mentioned the idea that America were, of course, partly involved in the division of the country. The idea that you mentioned about the Korean War and that there were so many American lives lost throughout the Korean War that it suddenly became a lot harder to walk away. But you also mentioned the fascinating idea that this almost became a test case in the world. This is a single people, a single nation divided between communism and the capitalist system here. And therefore it became a perfect testing ground for the system, and one in which America considered they had to win in the world theater here.
Right, absolutely. I think much as Germany was looked at as a test case for whether capitalism or communism was the superior system in Europe, Americans believed that other people in Asia would look at the Korean Peninsula, where you had two different political systems, two different ways of life, but the same national people. And so it would naturally be a sort of a showcase in which the relative merits of communism and capitalism were going to be demonstrated to other people in the developing world. So South Korea was very important to the United States for that reason. And as you mentioned, I also talk about the role of the Korean War. It would have been very difficult after the United States had lost lives, devoted hundreds of millions of dollars to fighting the Korean War, to just walk away and let it collapse.
And you mentioned earlier the idea that it was vitally important here that South Korea built that America over time here built up a functional middle class here. So let's talk about the rise, because a lot of this story comes about because South Korea was such a horribly poor nation at the start of this, and by the end of the 20th century, they are a wealthy, I suppose, in some ways, leader of the world economy. They're a firmly a middle power, and I suppose the institutions have grown here. So this in some part comes down to America here. So just what did America do? I mean, one of the most fundamental parts that you mention here is aid. And you mention at least one stat throughout the book that the aid that was coming into South Korea, at least in one particular year, was more than Americans' foreign aid for the entire world at that time.
Right. Well, I think economic aid was important, but I think it's also sort of interesting that the years that South Korea had the fastest growth rates were also the years in which it received the least economic aid. So one of the things the United States also wanted to do in South Korea was promote greater self-sufficiency. And that is something that I think they were successful at least some degree. When you look at aid, I think, though, it's also important to consider not just the economic aid, which I mentioned, but also military aid to South Korea, which was vast. And one of the things that I talk about in the book, which was also very important to South Korea's development, was the creation of this, incredibly powerful military establishment. Whenever I tell people that in 1954, South Korea had the fourth largest army in the world, they're like, what? It seems almost unbelievable. But South Korea had a military, an army of about 600,000 men or more at that time. And that was a huge army in terms of sheer numbers. What's also important about it is that if you were a senior officer in the military, you were gaining experience at governing an incredibly vast organization. It's larger, it was larger than many cities at the time and still larger than many cities today. So these military leaders, I argue, also came to believe that they had experiences and skills that could help in promoting rapid economic development, and that their experiences and that their abilities were superior to anybody in the civilian sector.
And in part, if that leads us down this road of what you mentioned earlier, the developmental autocracy, there is a narrative out there, one that often doesn't get debunked enough. And that is the idea that this was an American intention. And you write throughout the book that this is not something that America desired, that they weren't seeking a developmental autocracy. But you also write that when it came about, when it was suddenly present on the ground, they also had no plans to eradicate it and at least immediately remove it. And you mentioned that this outcome, both the creation of the autocracy and in part the failure of a policy to get rid of it, does come about through American policies on the ground. So they may not have wanted the autocracies to rise, but you mentioned that their policies did lead to this outcome, at least in part.
Yes, I think at minimum you can say that Americans tacitly consented to the existence of autocratic governments in South Korea, and even if the United States doesn't bear complete responsibility, it nonetheless supported dictatorships in South Korea at critical times that helped them to gain and maintain power. So I think that's. I think that's unquestionably an important part of what the United States did, and an important part of the American legacy in South Korea. One thing that I do say in the book is that in the 1960s, and this is where I think my views are more controversial, but I do think in the 1960s, Park Chung-hee was probably the best option that South Korea had. And I don't say that lightly, because there's many aspects of Park Chung-hee and how he governed that were autocratic, that are unattractive, that unquestionably mar his reputation, and to some degree even stain the reputation of the United States for supporting him. I wouldn't dispute that, but at the same time, I have difficulty envisioning the kind of rapid economic development that South Korea experienced under Park Chung-hee under different leadership. I think there was this brief democratic interlude in South Korea between 1960 and 1961. I think that government really struggled to assure stability and to get the economy going. Park Chung-hee, for all of his for all of his deficiencies and for all of the things that he may have done wrong when it came to democracy, he did have a great zeal for achieving economic development. He had a willingness to make pragmatic decisions that could promote economic development. And I think all of these things did help to it did help to get South Korea's economy going during the 1960s. And I think like many scholars and like many South Koreans today, I have very complex feelings about Park Chung-hee, but I do make that argument in my book.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because at the end of your book, in the final chapter, in the conclusion, there are a number of fascinating hypotheticals that you run through here. And of course, that in part is one of them. This idea that Park Chung-hee and his developmental focus was perhaps a necessary evil, that it couldn't have been achieved otherwise. So on that same point there, let's take a little bit of a sidetrack here. How do you see the Sungman Rhee era then? Because, of course, the focus was slightly different at the time, at least from the American side. They saw Park Chung-hee as being vitally important for developing the country. But they also, despite, as you mentioned quite a lot in the book as well, America didn't particularly warm to Sungman Rhee. They found him quite difficult. But did you see him the same way as Park Chung-hee, that he was a necessary evil, not for economic development, but for security issues?
Right, and I think that's certainly how the Americans saw him at the time. I also, I think one of the things with Syngman Rhee is that, and when you compare him to Park Chung-hee, is that there were times in the 60s where the Americans were genuinely enthusiastic about Park Chung-hee, and they wrote about him in glowing terms. They never did that about Syngman Rhee. They found Syngman Rhee frustrating. They would have liked an alternative leadership, but it's one of the things with Syngman Rhee is that he gained power not only because of the United States, or not only through the United States, but also because he was so good at manipulating South Korean politics to his own advantage. And so the United States tended to accept him as a necessary evil, because, partially because Rhee was so effective in suppressing potential alternatives. There was, though, during the Korean War, the United States even had, some plans that if Rhee really goes too far, we're going to get rid of him. Like they had this sort of, contingency plan. They never used it. Because they just, in the end, they kept saying that the disadvantages of doing it were greater than the potential risks and potential advantages. And, one interesting thing is if you, compare the situation to South Vietnam, the U.S. Ambivalence and dislike for Ngo Dinh Diem was in some ways comparable to how Americans felt about Syngman Rhee during the Korean War. But, they got rid of Diem, and some historians actually criticize this. They say, this was when the U.S. really lost the Vietnam War, when they got rid of Diem, because he was sort of not a great leader, but he was the person who could create an anti-communist coalition in South Vietnam. Now, I personally think there's other reasons that the United States was more successful in South Korea, or why or at least at preventing South Korea from going communist than it was at preventing South Vietnam from going communist. But nonetheless, I think it's sort of an interesting comparison in those terms. I think for the U.S., Rhee was a sort of necessary evil and they didn't see many alternatives. And as I look through it, I don't know that there were that many alternatives to Rhee that really would have worked. So again, it's just one of those things that you have complex feelings about, and there's no, I mean, history is messy. The realities on the ground were really messy, and there weren't any amazingly great options for the United States at the time.
So let's stick on that point of hypotheticals, though. It's just too fascinating here. You mentioned at the end of the book, when you speak through these hypotheticals, three key periods, and we just touched on two of them. Then the consolidation of power by Syngman Rhee, the seizure of power by Park Chung-hee, and of course the third period is the Chun DooHwan seizure of power from 1979 to 1980. Now this is a much more controversial period where a lot more people don't look back with the same kind of I suppose nuanced understanding, or if indeed that is even possible here. So I wonder how you see this period. Was this an important period? Because at least at this time South Korea seemed to be on the right developmental track. And it seemed to be, now it's hard to tell, a country that was ready for democracy. So how do you see this? Was there a viable alternative to this, or was Chun DooHwan a necessary evil or just an evil?
Right, and some people have, said even that I make a rather arbitrary distinction between, American support for dictatorship under Park and American support for dictatorship under Chun DooHwan. But I do think there is a distinction. I think one thing to realize with Park Chung-hee is that he actually won a couple of elections, and he used that they weren't completely fair elections, but he had some real base of people who liked him and supported him. Chun DooHwan really didn't. He seized power through a military junta, through violent suppression of dissidents in Gwangju and through the notorious Gwangju massacre. And this really was a period where a transition to democracy in South Korea was very much imaginable and possible, in my view. By this point, South Korea's economy was growing. It was significantly ahead of North Korea's by the late 1970s. Not as far ahead as some people would think, but it was still significantly ahead of North Korea, the North Korean economy by the late 1970s. And I think if you look at the kinds of institutions you needed for democracy, they were there, and you'd had already by 1979 well over 15 years or of sort of cultivating new groups of elites, the emergence of different elements of the population that were more supportive of democracy. So this was. I think this was the case in '79, and I think also, Chun DooHwan in general was he just didn't have as many redeeming characteristics as Park Chung-hee. I think Park Chung-hee, one thing about him is that some Koreans found him genuinely inspiring. I don't think you can say that many people felt that way about Chun DooHwan.
So on that point there seems to be something that we're missing here, and I've overlooked it as we've got lost in some of the hypotheticals here, but we must touch on it. And of course this explains the other half of your book in many ways. If it is the American input here and American nation building, I suppose in some ways one of the most important parts of your book is when you answer just why South Korea were so successful. And of course the answer that you come to here is that it is the Koreans and how they adopted and how they adapted to these American nation-building efforts. And you go back to Korean history in some ways, and you say that this is something that they've been used to. They've often been sandwiched between great powers, and they've had to, over time, negotiate their way through these things, adopt things, change things, and make them their own. And, of course, a vitally important part about this is the idea that, I suppose, a rarity in the world, South Korea and I suppose Korea in general, were a country that were colonized by an Asian power, Japan, and not a Western one.
Right, and I think what you touched on a few key points of the book that we haven't really gotten into that much. One is the what you call American nation building efforts, and in the book I discuss a variety of different aspects of how the United States tried to introduce ideas about economic development and democracy, and tried to encourage people from different groups in society, but especially elites, to cooperate with the government, but also to give them some sort of grounding that they could use to help to build South Korea into a democracy from the ground up. And I do make the point that even when the United States was doing a lot to even when the United States was supporting autocracy and dictatorship from the top down, you also have to look at what it was doing from the bottom up. Some people say, oh, this is, I'm skeptical that this had an impact, but I think it did. I think it did, not only from what I've looked at in Korea, but I think overall, if you look at the places that did eventually develop into Western style democracies, or if not Western style, develop into genuinely liberal democracies in Asia, an awful lot, those few places that did, there was an awful lot of American influence there. So that's one aspect. But another dimension of this that you touched on, which is also very important in my argument, is the idea of Korean agency, because South Korea isn't the only place where the United States tried to promote economic development. It's not the only country where the United States worked with students and intellectuals. The question is, why did they gain some degree of currency in South Korea? What attracted South Koreans to them? And again, I do think part of it goes to a sort of a deeper current of Korean history. And again, that's this idea that, Korea has always been a relatively small country, at least in the region that it's in. I mean, it's actually the size of Germany or Britain in terms of population and geography. But it's obviously always been, dwarfed in terms of size by China, and even smaller than Japan as well. So it's always had these characteristics, but I think this is also something that's made South Korea unique and special in a lot of ways, in that it knows how to adapt to different kinds of foreign ideas and institutions in ways that a lot of other countries don't or haven't been able to. It has a flexibility. Japanese colonialism was horrific. I've written about that, not only in my book, but I've also recently published a piece in the Washington Post, which sort of describes how Japan's inability to atone for its past is having a negative impact on the global economy. But I also think because Japanese colonialism was so horrific, and because Japan itself was not Western, but another Asian country, post-colonial nationalism in South Korea was directed at Japan more than it was directed at anywhere else. And, I think if you look at, say, China, there's powerful post-colonial nationalism. Japan is one of the targets, but they're also, in China, they also talk about the Opium War. And so the West is also sort of a target of post-colonial nationalism. I think in many other parts of the world that were subject to colonization by the European powers, that whole sense of post-colonialism really has a strong anti-Western component. In Korea, I don't think that was necessarily the case. It was, even today, there's just far more passion in both Koreas when it comes to sort of anti-Japan sentiment than it comes to anti-Western sentiment. Although I think in North Korea, it's sort of a little bit more even, where they're resentful of Japanese colonialism and they're resentful of American imperialism. But I think certainly today in South Korea, while not everybody loves the United States, post-colonial nationalism is still far more, I think tends to find itself directed far more towards Japan than it does to the United States or to the West.
So on that final point, is there any value in thinking that South Koreans were so receptive towards Americans due, at least in some part, to the memory of the Korean War, the idea that they fought side by side next to Americans? There was a memory that they had sacrificed for the nation as well, but also in part a memory of communist invasion, communist occupation, and suddenly I suppose a greater appreciation of the brutality that perhaps awaited them in the other ideology.
Yes, and I think one thing that I've become more aware of since I wrote the book is, the extent of cross-migration between the two Koreas before the Korean War, because, you could still cross the border a little, in between 1948 and 1950, and also, of course, between 1945 and 1948, when the two Koreas were under joint occupation. And you had to start with, in South Korea, a lot of people who fled from the north because they didn't like what Kim Il-sung and the Russians and the communists were doing. And then, of course, the Korean War itself was horrific. And there were atrocities committed by both sides. North Korea committed atrocities when it occupied South Korea between June of 1950 and about September of 1950, when MacArthur makes the Incheon landing, while at the same time, South Korean forces, with tacit approval by the United States, also committed their share of atrocities after the Incheon landing, when Truman, the Truman administration made this decision to try to roll back communism in Korea and obliterate the North Korean state. And neither side has forgotten these atrocities. It's one of the reasons that South Korea remained, and why there were always strong anti-communist voices in South Korea throughout the Cold War. But it also explains why today North Korea has so much trouble trusting South Korea and the United States. I think without this history, you can't understand Korean politics. And frankly, it's one of the problems I find in Washington, that so many policymakers want to look at the geopolitics of the Korean Peninsula and say, it's sort of like, just forget the past. Just deal with it rationally. But often, what's rational to the United States isn't rational to Koreans if you consider their history and if you appreciate their history, their history of suffering, both under Japanese colonialism and at the hands of the great powers during the Korean War.
Now, as a final question here, I might get you to, I suppose, sum things up a little bit here. We've touched on the development of Korea from a number of different angles here, and one of the things that might have got missed in some of it was the idea that, as we mentioned a lot here, South Koreans were quite receptive to Americans and American ideas. But from that history that we mentioned earlier, this deep history that they have of negotiating their way through the ideas and the power and the influences of great powers, is, I suppose, a core conclusion of your book here, and that is the idea that though Koreans were receptive, they were selective. They didn't just take things on wholeheartedly, or at least as a complete block. They were more selective and more conscious that they didn't want to be dominated again, and which comes to, I suppose, I think it is a core conclusion of your book here, but I might get you to clarify this for me. But it's the idea that what happened here and the success of Korea and their interaction with America was through what you mentioned as a constant process of negotiation.
Right. And I think this is also a process that you can say goes further back. I think if you look at Confucianism in Korea, and this is something that I'm not an expert on, but nonetheless, I think Confucianism manifested itself in the Chosun period differently to some degree than in Ming and Qing China. Well, Ming China especially. I mean, there were pretty close relations between the Chosun and the Ming dynasties, but at the same time, it wasn't the case that the Chosun just assimilated the Ming version of Confucianism wholesale and without adapting it in any ways. And that's also an important aspect of how South Koreans sort of adapted to American influence. And it wasn't necessarily always for the better. But I do think that if you look at the economic model that South Korea used during the 60s and 70s, and even if you look at the South Korean economy today, it still doesn't look that much like the U.S. economy or other Western economies. It's still, sort of, you still have these very powerful South Korean conglomerates that have an exorbitant influence over South Korea's economic system. So this is one way in which it was different. And when it came to aspects of democratization as well, there were certain ideas and concepts that South Koreans tried to adapt. The Americans tended to say, well, if you want to have democracy in South Korea, you have to dispense with South Korea's traditions. And Koreans actually often said the opposite. No, you can only build democracy on these traditions. And I don't know, to what degree these traditions are actually influential in Korean democracy today. But again, I think you can make a case that some of them are, or that at least there's certain Korean there's certain characteristics or Korean characteristics to Korean democracy. And I would also say there's one other point that I make in the book, and I criticize the United States on a lot of levels, but there's also one area that I praise the United States, and that is that Americans were flexible in some ways in their dealings with South Koreans. If something worked, if it was promoting economic growth, a lot of times the Americans were willing to say, well, this is working, let's let the South Koreans do things their way. And that was actually quite different, in my view, from the way things worked in the communist world, where the Soviet Union tended to insist on its path and its road to socialism needed to be adopted by the other countries in the communist world. And because it was so much more rigid, when there were fissures within the communist world, for instance, the Sino-Soviet split, they often ended up being very difficult and more permanent and enduring than the conflicts that occurred within the Western world.
So that's a great, thoughtful note to leave this on. Now, there is so much more in these two books that I didn't have a chance to get through today. And of course, all the details that we touched on, we had to touch on only fleetingly. But the two books that we've been speaking about, the first one is Nation Building in South Korea, Koreans, America, and the Making of a Democracy. And the second is Winning the Third World, Sino-American Rivalry During the Cold War. And both are the kind of rich, deeply researched, really detail-heavy kind of books you don't get these days. So I can't recommend them enough. So listeners, do go out there and buy them. And I am going to link them both below this podcast. So on that, Gregg Brazinsky, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
Okay, thank you very much for having me, Jed.